An anthology of the bad, the short-lived, and the forgotten shows and events from television history. You are listening to It Was a Thing on TV. Episode number 504, submission number 015B. The Ropers Revisited. The Ropers aired on ABC from March 13th of 1979 to May 15th of 1980 for 28 episodes. So we're back, guys, with another revisited episode. We're going back to the Ropers this time. The Ropers, in case you don't recall, it's a spinoff of Three's Company. And on the 50 worst TV shows of all time list, and we just covered this in the last month or so, it ranked at number 49, which all of us agreed it should not be on the list at all. And I think by the time we get through this episode, we're going to justify why this is not one of the 50 worst shows of all time. Unfortunately, I think it falls into the trap of it's a spinoff of one of the biggest shows on TV at that time, and it wasn't as good as the show it spun off of, so thus, it's a sucky show. It really isn't. Again, we'll get deeper into this as we go through this episode. So the basis of the series, the original landlords to Jack, Janet, and Chrissy's apartment on Three's Company, they basically bailed out. They got out of the apartment business and they moved into their own condo. Maybe like a townhouse. I think condo's a fair approximation as to the type of residence they have. And this is basically their new life in this new neighborhood, which admittedly for 1979 is, I'm going to use the word yuppie-ish, even though yuppie didn't really come into being until about 5 years later, until the mid-80s. I sort of do get a yuppie-ish vibe off of the Brookses, who we'll talk about in a little bit. The Ropers moved to this new community, Chevio Hills. And again, being very yuppie-ish, very quasi-upper class, let's say, or upper middle class. The Ropers had a little bit of a culture shock, if you will. They were not upper middle class type of people. They were hardworking people. They weren't into a lot of the stuff that maybe, let's say, Californians were into in the late 70s and early 80s. They're just an elderly couple. They're a couple in their 60s trying to live their life in semi-retirement. Because I don't think either Stanley Roper or Helen Roper, definitely not Helen Roper, but Stanley Roper didn't have really a job in this series. He did at points, but he didn't have any like really consistent work. You never saw him go to a job. There were sometimes he talked about money issues, but you never really saw Stanley actually making a living. They sold the apartment complex, so maybe that's how they're living. They bought the townhouse, and they're living off the proceeds of that. Possibly. So this series, a lot of it is that culture clash of older couple with the younger couple next door with their kid. And a lot of what I saw was very, very reminiscent of Three's Company. Without spoiling too much of the series, you have a lot of the misunderstandings that maybe Jack or Chrissy would have gotten into in Three's Company, but now it's a misunderstanding by the Brookses or a misunderstanding by Stanley Roper or something in that regard. I don't want to call it a Three's Company trope, but maybe that's the best definition to use here, a Three's Company trope. There's a misunderstanding, and then at the end, again, it just has that Three's Company type of ending where, yeah, there's the misunderstanding and something goofy happens. Generally, there's a couple of episodes that the goofiness doesn't happen, but again, I see a lot of Three's Company here, and maybe that's the reason why it was ranked number 49 on the worst TV shows of all time. Maybe it's just a lack of originality. Hey, you're doing stuff that we've already seen for 2 seasons or 3 seasons before this on Three's Company. Where's the originality? Where's something different being brought to the table? I think that's as good of a reason as any to maybe put this on the worst TV shows list. And I do see a lot of similarities there. But also, let's go back to the theme song for a second, because again, similarities. If you heard that theme song, you heard that little bit that sounds like Three's Company. Come and knock on our door. And you hear near the end of the theme, so again, maybe a little too derivative? Just saying. But also, I want to talk about who did the music for this show, because this guy, I don't think he gets enough credit for what he's done outside of Three's Company and the Ropers. Joe Raposo, who I really think was the music of our childhood in terms of Electric Company, in terms of Sesame Street, just did so many classic songs for Sesame Street back in the day. Being Green, C is for Cookie, just so many great songs from back in the 70s that, again, were pieces of our childhood. And unfortunately, and this is, I don't want to say tragic, but Joe Raposo, he died at 51. So, I mean, he hasn't been around for 35 years, and he's just that influential on so many TV shows from back in the day. The characters themselves in this show, really, when you look at who was on this show as regular cast members, this, outside of like 1 or 2 people, is just an amazing who's who of like real television talent. And we're going to start, obviously, with the main character himself, Stanley Roper, played by Norman Fell. We're going to talk about Norman Fell in the very near future because he was a regular on Dan August. And we all know what Dan August is.
A Quinn Martin production.
Yeah, and you know what other Quinn Martin production he was on, Mike?
What was that?
He was on the FBI because it is featured in that one scene in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood where Leonardo DiCaprio's character, Rick Dalton, appears on the FBI. By the way, here's a fun fact, Mike. Do you know who was originally in that episode of the FBI that was in the scene that Leo DiCaprio reenacted?
I really don't know.
Burt Reynolds.
Who was Dan August? And as I just said, Dan August, it was
A Quinn Martin production.
But Greg, I want to like play a technicality here. The FBI was a QM production.
Or sometimes it was a QM Warner Brothers production.
And the thing is, I can find a QM production sounder because that's the way Barnaby Jones was introduced in its final season. It was a QM production. Don't think I can find a QM WB production or QM Warner Brothers production, but such is life. So now that we just like tied everything to Dan August between Norman Fell and Burt Reynolds. We're going to go to his wife, Helen Roper, played by Audra Lindley. And I shared this maybe about 3 weeks ago to a month ago with both Greg and Chico. I found a picture, I don't even remember where, it was on Facebook somewhere, of a very young Audra Lindley in a bathing suit. So I'm guessing this is probably from the 40s or 30s, probably the 30s. She looked like she was maybe in her 20s or so. Good heavens, was she beautiful as a young lady? Which asks the question, what the hell happened to her?
Norman Fell happened to her.
Oh, no, that's not. No, I'm putting my foot down. No. Norman Fell happened to her. Why I oughta. But in addition to the Ropers and Three's Company, Audra Lindley played Amy Fitzgerald on a series that I think we got to cover sooner rather than later. Bridget Loves Bernie. Very controversial back in the day, but also very popular back in the day. The neighbors on this series are the Brookses. And Jeffrey Brooks is played by probably one of the best talents over the last 45 to 50 years, the one and only Jeffrey Tambor. And where could we start with Jeffrey Tambor? I think we've got to start with George Bluth Sr. on Arrested Development. That's the place I remember him. I don't even really remember him from the Ropers or anything before Arrested Development. But that also speaks to how uncultured I am, because I'm sure he's done a lot more between 1979, 1980, and 2002, whenever Arrested Development started. Oh no, what was he on? Wasn't he on an HBO series of some sort? Wasn't he on Larry Sanders or something like that? Yeah. He did 89 episodes of Larry Sanders' show. I knew I remembered him from someplace between 79 and 2002. Playing his wife, Ann Brooks, is Patricia McCormick. And actually, Greg, I don't know if you saw your Quinn Martin opens this week. Patricia McCormick, she was a guest star on, I believe it was Canon.
No, I haven't. I've been busy with other things this week to not have a chance to see any of the Quinn Morton stuff on MeTV this week.
Actually, now that I'm looking at it, I think it was Streets of San Francisco, because I think that is in 1974. Barnaby Jones is definitely in 76, I believe. And Cannon, it says she was in an episode in 1975. I think Cannon's in 74 now, too. So she was a guest on an episode of Streets of San Francisco back in 1974. And, of course, the commonality between all the three of those series, they're all
A Quinn Martin production.
Patricia McCormick, or Patty McCormick, if you will. She's obviously been in the business for well over 50 years. The biggest thing that I see for her post The Ropers is she was Liz LaCerva on 5 episodes of The Sopranos, which was not.
A Quinn Martin production.
Playing the young son, David Brooks, is a gentleman by the name of Evan Cohen. And unfortunately, Evan Cohen has not done much acting post The Ropers. The only real thing he's known for was he was on 11 episodes of the series It's Not Easy from 1982 and 1983. He did an episode of Alice, and he did a voice in My Father Was a Hero, and he was on Summer of Sam back in 1999, but that's it. That's his career. There's some other names that we'll get into throughout the series. Those are the primary cast members in 28 episodes. But there's definitely more names, and now that the shows are out there to be seen on a regular basis, we could definitely fill in some of the gaps as to what this person did on this show. So let's hop into the episodes. We're going to start with the first episode of season 1, which is Moving On. Mrs. Roper has her heart set on an apartment that would require that Stanley get a job in order to afford. Nothing will prevent them from getting it, that is, unless Mr. Roper can make himself an undesirable neighbor. I thought Mr. Roper is the undesirable neighbor after they get the townhouse, apartment, condo, whatever you want to call it. You'll find out why later in the series. So that's your basic introductory episode to the series. The Ropers move on from Three's Company, and they're going to get their own place. That takes us to episode 2, which is Friends and Neighbors. The Brookses are expecting a congressman to drop by, and Jeffrey doesn't want the Ropers around when he comes. So there's the class warfare, if you will. You've got the Brookses, who, again, are upper middle class. They want to be the popular folks. You know, they're contemporary. And then you've got the Ropers, who are, I don't want to say more traditional, but they're older, and they have a different value set, let's say, than a contemporary late 70s, early 80s couple. Playing the congressman in this episode, James, no last name given for the character, but he was played by Roger Bowen. Probably best known for playing Henry Blake in the 1970 movie version of MASH.
And that was the character portrayed by McLean Stevenson on the show MASH.
Oh, I was also going to mention that it was a thing on TV Hall of Famer, John Schuck, actually uttered the first F-bomb in a major motion picture in MASH. And actually, I just saw that on Turner Classic Movies within the last 2 weeks, I believe, and actually saw that scene. It was a scene of the 4077 playing football, and there's John Schuck learning out the F-bomb.
Oh, Shuck.
No. He said an F-bomb, not Shuck. Never mind. Episode 3 is titled Your Money or Your Life. Stanley's physical checkup for a life insurance policy has him convinced his days are numbered. And actually, Jeffrey Brooks, one of his jobs, or at least based on the sort of context clues in this episode and throughout the series, he's an insurance salesman. So he's pushing Stanley Roper to get an insurance policy, not just for Stanley and Helen's benefit, but for his own personal benefit. He's making a commission of sorts. We got 2 names on this episode, and one of them, now that we can see the series, there's a little more context as to what this person's role is on the show. First, we're going to start with Bill Marsh, who's played by John Fiedler, who we've talked about quite a bit. We talked about him on Buffalo Bill. We talked about how he voiced Piglet. And he was in one of my favorite movies of all time, the original 12 Angry Men. He was juror number 2. But if you heard his voice, you'd know exactly who he is. He's got a very high-pitched voice. Obviously, he voiced Piglet, so that's got to be a higher-pitched voice. But he's been on so many things that we've talked about. Not putting him in the Hall of Fame just yet, but he's a potential candidate, to say the least. But the second name in this episode. Now, like I said, we have a little bit of information as to how this person plays into the grand scheme of everything. Playing Marilyn Graham is Lois Hamilton. We've talked about her in the past. She was a card dealer on the original Card Sharks back in the 70s and early 80s. But also, she appeared, I think, on 2 weeks, maybe 3, of Match Game Hollywood Squares Hour. She was actually, I think we mentioned this in the original episode, in like the most TV series in 1983, I believe, or 1984. She made a lot of guest appearances. But now where she comes into play as Marilyn Graham, since, again, this is a contemporary apartment complex, condo complex, townhouse complex, however you want to phrase it, it's 1979, and there's a communal hot tub. And all she does, not even joking, never saw her in any role besides this, she enters the hot tub in a bikini. And you either have Jeffrey Brooks there, or you have Stanley Roper. Never do you see the women to start with in the hot tub. And maybe you'll see both guys in the hot tub at the same time. I think that was actually the case in this episode when they were talking about insurance. And then here comes Lois Hamilton in bikini, come to sit in the hot tub because she's got stress to burn off, or maybe it's just the TNA factor because it is the late 70s. But yeah, that's her role. You never saw her in, I'll say true acting, but I'm going to say true acting. You never saw her as the neighbor coming over and saying, "Oh, I need sugar." You never saw her doing anything, I don't want to say of value, but I'm going to say that. She didn't do anything of value. She just went to the hot tub and interrupted whatever Brooks and Roper were talking about, and hilarity ensued. And she put her head underwater, and yeah, and both the guys would be acting all goofy around him in the age before politically correctness and Me Too were things. But also, generally, when you saw Lois Hamilton, you saw her sister in the hot tub too, or come to the hot tub eventually. And again, don't want to spoil anything, but this person was always in a bikini, and they were usually sort of flirtatious, playing with Mr. Roper, playing with Mr. Brooks, at least until the wives got involved. And her name was Linda Graham, and she was played by Gillian Kestner. No longer with us. She passed away in 2007 at the age of 58. But yeah, I mean, you take a look at her IMDb. She didn't do many episodes of any certain TV series, except for one. And we actually talked about this again in the 50 worst TV shows of all time. She played Melba in Coed Fever, and I totally forgot about this. Even though one episode aired, there were 8 episodes produced, or at least 8 episodes. So that's how bad that first airing was. 7 episodes went unaired. But yeah, I could see her definitely as a Coed Fever type. Next up is episode 4, The Doris Letters. Mrs. Roper thinks her husband is having an affair when she finds his hidden stash of love letters written to a woman named Doris. This just irritated Mrs. Roper. She thought Stanley was cheating on her. In the end, Doris is Doris Day. He was just a big fan of Doris Day. To which just Mrs. Roper died laughing in the last 10-15 seconds of the episode. "Oh, these goofy letters are written for Doris Day? Ha 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 ha."
What, have you seen Doris Day? She's a tomato.
I'm not disagreeing with that, but just all these letters written to Doris were fan letters to Doris Day. But also, if they're fan letters, why doesn't Doris Day have them? Why does Stanley Roper still have them? Well, maybe they're just I don't want to say diary entries, but that might be the best description. Unsent letters, essentially diary entries. Episode 5 is titled The Family Planning. Helen's mother comes for a visit, but later is revealed that she has no place to go. So Helen and her 2 sisters get together to decide what to do, because none of them really want her living with them. I don't blame Stanley for saying, no, her mother can't live here, because it's his mother-in-law. You want your mother-in-law hanging around? Probably not. But we do have 3 names here. One of the daughters, who's actually quite a recurring character, Ethel Armbruster, is Dina Dietrich, who we've talked about plenty. The place that most people from the 70s and 80s would remember her from is she was Mother Nature in the chiffon margarine commercials. You don't mess with Mother Nature. Her husband, who does appear in a number of episodes, is Hubert Armbruster. He's played by Rod Colban. Did a little bit of everything for quite a while. He was essentially that guy from that show. He did 7 episodes of Barney Miller from 1977 to 1982. But beyond that, outside of 3 episodes of Quincy, he appeared generally on 1 or 2 episodes of different series. But again, we'll see him in the future. He does make a total of 4 appearances on the Ropers. Playing Hilda, and this is definitely somebody we've talked about, is Lucy Lee Flippin. And when I look at her, I know I've definitely seen her on TV shows in the past. We did talk about her previously on 1 episode of Erie, Indiana, and an episode of The Munsters Today. She actually did appear in 18 episodes of Little House on the Prairie and 23 episodes of Flow. That's a series that I think we got to cover one day, Flow. Finally, playing the mother of Helen Roper in this episode is Lucille Benson. Hasn't been with us for over 40 years. She's another person that made the rounds. She appeared on 3 episodes of Alice. Now, hold on. One of her credits is Pitfall 1982 Atari 2600 commercial. Did we cover that? I'm pretty sure we did in the Atari ads.
We did.
That's the one with Jack Black.
Yes, that's the one with Jack Black. She plays the older woman in that commercial. Well, probably the only woman in that commercial. But yes, so we did talk about her previously. And she was also Lily Sinclair on 17 episodes of Bosom Buddies.
Well, let me just say, the Pitfall Atari 2600 commercial doesn't hold a candle to the ice hockey 2600 commercial with Phil Hartman.
Oh no, that's an absolute classic. Next up is the final episode of Season 1, Opportunity Knocks. Helen's luncheon makes her consider leaving the Chevio Hills neighborhood. Stanley believes her, and without asking, has Jeffrey Brooks put their home on the market? Will the Ropers really relocate? Lois Hamilton appears in this episode as Marilyn Graham again. So obviously she ends up in the hot tub. And Richard Klein makes an appearance as Larry Dallas. So there's a crossover from Three's Company. So there's a little bit of a cliffhanger potentially for the end of Season 1. Are the Ropers really going to move? Nah, because what would happen with Season 2? That would be kind of awkward. Now, Season 2 starts off with the party. Mr. Roper decides to throw his wife a surprise party. He asks his former tenants, Jack, Janet, and Chrissy, to help him. When Brooks sees him with them, he jumps to conclusions. Oh, didn't I just mention this at the start of the show about there's misconceptions and a lot of the tropes that you saw in Three's Company are making their way to the Ropers? This sounds just like that. There is jumping to conclusions, a misunderstanding, and hilarity ensues. As you can guess, we have Joyce DeWitt playing Janet, we have John Ritter playing Jack Tripper, and Suzanne Summers plays Chrissy Snow. That'll take us to episode 2 of Season 2, Days of Beer and Rosie. A man shows up and claims to be Stanley's son. Stanley admits to know his mother, but doesn't remember the night that she claimed to conceive her son. Roper goes to talk to a friend who was with him at the time to find out if the claims are true. So we got a little bit of a paternity drama here.
Too bad Maury's not going to be on for like another 40 years.
No, Maury started like 1991 or so. Now, I know the DNA shows probably didn't start till about 2002-ish, but I get your point. I believe this is the person who claims to be Stanley's son, Squire Friedel. He played Bill in this episode. I mentioned him being Stanley's son, but there's another reason that I'm mentioning him in this episode. He was Ronald McDonald in Mac and Me.
Oh, since we mentioned Mac and Me, we got to play the clip.
And I'm going to put Diana Muldaur falling down the elevator shaft here.
I really don't want to talk about it.
Oh my God!
No, not that one, Mike. The other one.
Eric! Like...
And actually, if you look at his IMDb, I'm not even joking about this. He's done so much stuff related to Ronald McDonald. In what I'm guessing are the McDonald Land commercials in the 80s and early 90s, he played Ronald McDonald.
If only he knew, like in 35 years or so, Grimace would be like the most important thing in a baseball team right now.
Episode 3 is titled Power Play. On the day that Helen is making dinner to impress her rich sister Ethel, utilities are cut off because Stanley forgot to pay the bills. He goes to great lengths to hide his mistake. I'm going to alter that a little bit because there wasn't one mistake. There were multiple mistakes in this episode. So he didn't pay the electricity. So basically, this whole dinner for Ethel and her husband was done in the dark, minus one lamp that Stanley used extension cords to connect to the Brooks' power. So when Brooks gets home and sees this extension cord or these cords going to Roper's house, he yanks on the extension cord and he pulls the plug out of the wall and everything goes dark and Roper is panicking. Just, can you plug it into the wall? I just need you to keep it plugged in for a few more minutes. No, I'm not going to. So dinner's ruined in that regard. No electricity. But also, again, not a mistake with just the power. He didn't pay the gas bill. So Stanley actually cooked dinner in the Brooks' house. And if, let's say, for instance, Ethel wanted a drink, she wanted ice water, or I think she actually mentioned Perrier, so that gives you a time frame as to when this was, when Perrier was really big in the late 70s, early 80s. Stanley had to run to the Brooks' house, get ice from their refrigerator, their freezer, and then get the Perrier water from, it could have been from their refrigerator, the Roper's refrigerator, but it's just basically, again, one of those situations, very Three's Company-esque, where something's wrong and let's go to the Brooks house and cook the food and get the ice and get the alcohol and whatever else. But then Stanley gets the dinner and the dinner's only partially cooked. So at that point, Stanley's like, hey, let's go out and get dinner. Ethel says, I need to use the bathroom first. And Stanley says, you don't want to do that. Stanley forgot to pay the water bill too. So then Stanley's like, okay, let's go out for dinner. And oh yeah, don't go to the bathroom. Hold it until we get to the restaurant. So Stanley's calling for reservations. Well, I'm sorry, I should say he's trying to call for reservations because guess what? He didn't pay the phone bill either. End of episode.
Hold on. How do you forget to pay the phone bill?
It happens. But also, maybe it's just me. Don't they give you like 3 months or 6 months leeway?
Yeah.
They're not just going to cut it off after a month. We do have a character, and if I remember correctly, this person might have been like the electrician, somebody to fix the electricity, playing Don Webster. It was the Thing on TV Hall of Famer Cliff Norton. We've talked about him plenty. I remember talking about him in Where's Huddles, where he was title character, Mr. Huddles. Going to episode 4, titled Baby Talk. Helen adores the Brooks' boy, David, which leads her to feel she and Stanley could adopt a baby. Stanley is against it. Still, she calls an agency and sets up a home interview. Before the show, Greg, you were curious about what the end result of this was.
Yes, because I remember this back in the original episode.
The end result actually is going to lead us to the next episode, but briefly, they were denied the ability to adopt because the agency viewed them as too old to take care of a kid. They were looking for a younger couple.
Good.
But as I said, this ties into the next episode. In the last 30 seconds, minute of this episode, Stanley feels bad for Helen, and instead of getting a little kid, he gets her a little puppy. Well, again, it's maybe not a kid, but there's the responsibilities like a kid. And even in the final segment of the show, the final 5 seconds, 10 seconds, Stanley gives Helen the dog and says, oh, by the way, doggy did a little poopsie in the kitchen. Even Stanley's not taking responsibility for the dog. Typical Stanley. I don't know if it necessarily transitions to the next episode as listed on IMDb, but it does transition to the next episode as it's shown on Plex. So just a word of warning. So we're going to go to the 5th episode, but we're going to come back and visit the puppy dog on the 6th episode. Episode 5 is called Two for the Road. Both Stanley and Jeffrey argue with their wives and walk out on them at the same time. Getting drunk at a bar brings them together as buddies, but sobering up may open their eyes to a big problem they've unwittingly created. The short way of describing this is they end up in jail, partially for parking tickets that Mr. Roper accrued. But Brooks in this episode, talking about Jeffrey Brooks, when he's in prison or jail, he really needs to use the bathroom. And he asks one of the officers, hey, can I go to the bathroom? And officer says, yeah. And while I think shaking the officer's hand, Brooks ends up getting his gun. And remember, Brooks is drunk. He's drunk as a skunk. He's totally blotto. So he doesn't realize he took the gun. And now everybody in the police station's, fearing for their lives because, hey, there's this drunk guy with a gun. Hilarity ensues, to say the least. But we actually have a name playing that officer who had the handgun and let Jeffrey Brooks out to go to facilities. The officer's name is Officer Hibbs, and he's played by Dick Christie, who we all remember, probably, as Ted Lawson, the father on the seminal 1980s sitcom Small Wonder.
Hold on. He's no Dick Pound, the head of the IOC drug testing committee. True story. Oh, hold on a second. Sam Darnold's grandfather, and this is a true story, his name was Dick Hammer.
He's the Minnesota Hammer, throwing touchdowns. He'll get Jordan Addison a touchdown. He'll get Justin Jefferson a touchdown. He's a touchdown machine, the Minnesota Hammer.
Hell, he'll get Paul Allen a touchdown.
Oh, do we really want to see 60, 70-year-old Paul Allen getting a touchdown? Well, you know what? The way he reacts, he might as well be part of the team. And as we've established in this podcast, Paul Allen is the worst homer in professional sports. He is terrible.
So that's going to take us to episode 6. And as I said, the puppy from the end of episode 4 plays a big role in this episode. The episode is titled Puppy Love. Obviously, the puppy's going to have a big part in this episode. Stanley's going to be in trouble if Helen finds out he's lost her new puppy Muffin on a walk. He decides that a lookalike just might fool her and get him off the hook. Will Stanley get away with it or be barked at by Helen? Spoiler, he got barked at by Helen. The only guest to note, again, Lois Hamilton appears because apparently Muffin the puppy went in the hot tub. Or maybe just to avoid Helen, Stanley goes in the hot tub and, hey, there's a male in the hot tub. Let's bring in Lois Hamilton in a bikini just because. It's the late 70s. What do you expect? TNA. Episode 7 is titled All Around the Clock. The clock Stanley gives Helen for their anniversary turns out to be stolen from the Brooks' apartment. Again, Three's Company misunderstandings here. The clock was not stolen from the Brooks' apartment. Moving on to episode 8, titled Odd Couples. A fire in the kitchen leaves the Ropers having to stay with the Brooks family until their place is ready again. However, Stanley's behavior gets on Jeffrey's last nerve. Not just that, but the fire in the kitchen was actually caused by Stanley's handiwork. He was fixing a toaster and, well, something more than all toasters toast. Apparently, toasters also can toast apartments. And there's actually a big issue, again, a misunderstanding, since, again, a lot of misunderstandings in this and Three's Company. There is a misunderstanding when somebody is looking to rent an apartment in the complex and Stanley starts talking about his toaster. He blames it on faulty wiring, even though it was his own doing with tinkering around with the toaster. So he tells this prospective apartment buyer about the situation, and the guy does not move into the apartment or does not agree to a contract because, oh, there's faulty wiring here. So that actually screws Brooks over because Brooks, I think, was getting a commission. He may have some sort of ownership stake in this apartment complex, but Brooks is not terribly happy with the little white lie that Roper told. Moving on to episode 9, which is titled Hal Joey. Helen hires Stanley's friend Joey to haul out their furniture so she can redecorate. Her brother-in-law Hubert hears of Helen's plan and decides to buy some new furniture. Joey offers to sell his furniture for him and sells it to Stanley. When Helen sees he bought her sister's furniture, she freaks out. Hey, it's another misunderstanding. Go figure. In this episode, Ethel returns, Dina Dietrich, and so does Hubert, Rod Colban. Joey in this episode is played by Richard B. Schull. Even though he was that guy from That Thing, he was in all 13 episodes of Holmes and Yo-Yo. He was Holmes! Remember, John Shuck was Yo-Yo. He was Holmes. Richard B. Schull.
Aw, shuck.
Episode 10 is titled Helen Makes Music. Helen really wants an electric organ, but Stanley won't pay for one. Anne has an emergency and asks Helen to do her a favor by showing a buyer some property. An embarrassing situation may complicate things because, of course, it's the Ropers and Three's Company by extension. There's got to be a situation that may complicate things. In the end, Helen does end up getting an organ. It was a thank you gift from the Brooks family for showing that property that was bought. Episode 11 is titled The Skeleton. Jeffrey Brooks has a secret. His Uncle Bill is a free-spirited hobo who has no interest in material things. To his horror, Bill shows up at his doorstep, but not before Stanley meets him and hires Bill to help around his place. Playing that Uncle Bill is Barry Nelson. We did talk about Barry Nelson in the past. We talked about that episode of Climax where he played the original James Bond. Episode 12 is titled The Other Man. When Stanley is being inattentive towards Helen, she decides to make him jealous by pretending to have an affair with the gardener. Both Anne and Jeffrey Brooks decide to help out and also hire some other guys to pose as Helen's lover. Again, a misunderstanding. And actually, it comes to a head near the end of the episode because the gardener and those other people to pose as lovers, I think of all things, they share the same name. Maybe they don't share the same name, but again, they're all intertwined into this menage a trois, if you will. Yeah, it's like a menage a four because we have the gardener, and then we have another person, I believe, playing a gardener in this episode, and then a third guy who's playing a gardener in this episode, all of Hispanic origin. So that really complicates matters when you have three gardeners, all of basically the same ethnicity, and I think all three don't even know what they're doing. How did I get roped into this?
After 3, it just becomes an orgy.
They're not having sex, Chico. It's just a misunderstanding. Again, it's one of those goofy Ropers things. But also, we do have Linda Graham in this episode, as played by Gillian Kesner. So, again, there must have been a hot tub scene. So maybe it's now like a menage a cease, because you've got Stanley and maybe Linda Graham, and then you've got Mrs. Roper and these three guys. I don't know. Hilarity ensued. Let's move on before who knows what happens. Oh gosh, after that episode, I don't know if I can say this episode title with a straight face. Episode 13, Who's Been Sleeping in My... ... question mark. A young woman without a place to live has been sleeping in the Roper's storage room. Stanley thinks the girl is a dangerous dope fiend, while Helen wants to let her stay. So this runaway was played by Stevie Louise Valance. And the runaway's name is Jenny Bollinger. Stevie Louise Valance, she was Sylvie in 7 episodes of Knots Landing. And wait, hold on a second. She played Was-It Kangaroo in Zoobilee Zoo? Outside of Ben Vereen, I don't think we've ever talked about any Zoobilee Zoo characters before. And actually, this character, Jenny Bollinger, does actually stick around for a number of episodes. I don't think she made it to the end of the series, but she's definitely a third roommate with the Ropers for a number of episodes. And that includes episode 14, which, oddly enough, is titled Jenny's Date. Mr. Roper decides to fix Jenny up with Brooks's nephew, and Brooks freaks out upon learning about it. Because how dare one of his relatives date somebody associated with the Ropers? Moving on to episode 15 of season 2. It's titled Of Mice and Horses. Ethel tries to get a China horse, supposedly from the Ming Dynasty, away from Helen. So it's a bit of a sibling rivalry. This China horse is a family antique, and Ethel and Helen are fighting to get control of it. I don't know if specifically the mother left it to one of them to fight over, but they get into a little quibble here over this horse. So obviously, if Ethel's in this episode, that means Dina Dietrich appears, and the mother, Lucille Benson, appears again. And I think in the end, it turned out that this China horse from the Ming Dynasty was not a fake, but like a replica. It didn't have value. It wasn't from the Ming Dynasty. Episode 16, and this, I think, really is like my favorite episode of this series. It's titled Family Feud. Helen and David's birthday party is a disaster when first Stanley and Jeffrey and then Helen and Anne start squabbling. So the Brookses and the Ropers have a joint birthday party for both Helen and David, the little kid. The plan is to have a puppet show for David, and Stanley and Jeffrey Brooks, they're the puppet masters in this little puppet show. And with this squabbling, unfortunately, or fortunately, because this is hilarious, I think, the squabbling carries over to the puppet show where each of their puppets start making attacks at the other person. So Brooks, his puppet was coincidentally bald or balding, and Stanley's puppet was like a bird, a penguin. And after a little while, they start off really friendly, really copacetic with the puppet show, but then somebody says something. I don't remember if it was Brooks to Roper or Roper to Brooks, but one of them makes a crack at the other person, and I think it was Jeffrey Brooks making a crack at Stanley's expense, but then Stanley comes back and says, "Yeah, what are you talking about, Baldy?" And Brooks pops his head over the scenery where the puppet show is going on and says, "Do you want to say that to my face?" or sign to the accent. It gets really goofy, and finally in the end, Helen and Anne Brooks tell the guys, "Hey, this is really for David. This is his puppet show. Be friends. Even if you want to strangle each other, do it for the little kid." And again, it's really funny but also, like I said, a little heartwarming in the end. We do have, again, Stevie Louise Valance as Jenny Bollinger in this episode. And actually, I think she helps out with the party as well, maybe getting the puppets, but there's no other guest stars in that episode, so we'll just move on to episode 17, The Other Woman. Helen is convinced Stanley is having an affair when she sees him give a locket to another woman. There's nobody of note in that episode, so we're going to just move on to episode 18, which is titled Men About the House. Helen volunteers Stanley to babysit on his poker night, and Jeffrey is just a little peeved when David Brooks comes home and starts telling Daddy about poker and the pennies that he won playing poker that night. Yes, Stanley Roper taught little 5-year-old David Brooks how to play poker. And actually, we have Joey returning, so that means in this episode is Richard B. Shull. Episode 19 is titled Old Flames. Stanley is jealous when Helen wants to reunite with an old boyfriend who is in town, so he tries to reconnect with an old girlfriend to get even with her. Also, David trades Jeffrey's model train set for Stanley's old inner tube. We do have Lucille Benson appearing as Helen's mother in this episode. But actually, we do have a big name playing Tom Cummins in this episode. James Callahan.
Charles in Charge. He was Walter Powell.
There you go. We're almost there. Just a few more episodes to go. Episode 20. Another great episode. Highly recommended. The Rummage Sale. Stanley fears Helen accidentally gave a box containing his girly magazines to a church rummage sale. So again, there's a misunderstanding. Stanley goes to the rummage sale, is going through this box, trying to hide the magazines from basically everybody, mainly the church elders. Jeffrey Brooks gets wind of this and says, "Oh, you want these magazines? It's going to cost you $30.
$30 in 1980 money?
That's the price if you don't want the congregation knowing that you have girly magazines in there." But again, in the end, it's a huge misunderstanding because all that was in that box of those $30 worth of magazines were gardening magazines. So somewhere in the Roper's attic, there's a box with girly magazines. 2 more episodes to go. Episode 21 is titled 4-Letter Word. Running out of money, Stanley needs to take a job on the killing floor at his brother-in-law Hubert's meatpacking plant. Later, his fortunes change when he learns Hubert is planning a secret trip to Acapulco with his secretary. Boy, you know, if this is a year earlier, they could have gone on Three's a Crowd. You could have had Hubert and Ethel and Hubert's secretary. That's going to take us to the final episode. Episode 22 is Mother's Wake. Helen and her sisters are shocked by their elderly mother wanting to have a wake for herself. She invites others to say goodbye in advance. Also, Jeffrey throws out his back and is trapped in a chair. So during this entire wake, he is literally chair-ridden because he can't move. So we do have Lucille Benson appearing again as Helen's mother. And we do have Ethel Armbruster, Deanna Dietrich. And we do also have Lois Hamilton appearing because apparently there was a hot tub involved at the wake. That's kind of creepy. Maybe there's not. And also, in this final episode, we have Jenny Bollinger again. So she was in like most of the last 8 episodes or so. Maybe to save the show and save the ratings? I don't know. But that is the series. That's 28 episodes. Again, having seen most of the episodes, I really think this was given the short end of the stick. This is not a bad series. It's very derivative at times. Again, a lot of the humor is very similar to what you'd see on Three's Company. A lot of misunderstandings, very similar to what you'd see on Three's Company. Maybe if they went in a different direction and made it not so much like The Parent Show, maybe it would have had better success. But this show did have a little bit of success. If you look at the schedule, The Ropers originally aired on Tuesday nights at, of all hours, 10 p.m. That's an unusual time for a sitcom to be on 10 p.m. Usually sitcoms end at about 9. But if you take a look at this lineup for Tuesday on ABC in 1978/79, well, there's one loser in the bunch. But the other 5 shows, including the Ropers, these are powerhouse TV shows. 8 p.m. you had Happy Days. 8:30 p.m. you had Laverne and Shirley. 9 p.m. you had Three's Company. 9:30 you had Taxi. And then at 10 you had the Ropers. And the one real bust that night at 10:30 was 13 Queens Boulevard. If you look at the ratings for those first 5 shows, Happy Days was the 3rd highest rated show of the 1978-79 season. Laverne and Shirley was number 1. Three's Company was number 2. Taxi was number 9. The Ropers was number 8. So you literally had 5 of the top 10 TV shows on television in 1978 and 79 on ABC Tuesday nights. That is a powerhouse lineup. However, as what happens with a number of shows, the following season it gets moved. So it's not with that powerhouse lineup on Tuesdays anymore. It's moved to Saturdays. 8 p.m. on Saturdays, as a matter of fact. After the Ropers at 8 p.m. on Saturdays, you had Detective School and A New Kind of Family. But then 9 to 11, again, 2 pretty big shows. 9 to 10, you had Love Boat. And 10 to 11, you had Fantasy Island. So maybe the Ropers was moved to try and give ABC Saturday night as well. Because, yeah, the Love Boat and Fantasy Island, big ratings winners for quite a few years. But that 8 to 9 lineup just didn't work. And if we take a look at the competition, when it originally aired on Tuesdays, now again, it's going to get high ratings. On CBS, it was in the 3rd half hour of CBS Tuesday Night Movies. And then on NBC, it was against the 3rd half hour of The Big Event. So I'm guessing 2 movies. At least 1 movie, but I'm guessing The Big Event on NBC was a TV movie of some sort. But when it moved to Saturdays, the competition, well, CBS had Working Stiffs. And actually, I think we're going to cover that one day because that was a sitcom with Michael Keaton and James Belushi. I think that was one of Michael Keaton's first appearances on TV. On NBC, though, yeah, I think this is going to win, even against the Ropers in 79 and 80. Chips. The first half hour of Chips. So maybe Chips was sort of a death blow. I don't know. But I think the biggest thing that killed the Ropers was moving it away from that powerhouse time slot on Tuesdays to maybe try and take over Saturdays. And I know TV's a different beast nowadays than when it was seemingly 45 years ago at this point. But Saturday nights is not a time that a lot of people are watching TV, even though, again, Love Boat, Fantasy Island, great shows in their own right. So maybe if it stuck around that Tuesday night lineup, it may have lasted longer. Don't know. Because looking at this, at the 8:30 time slot on Tuesdays, they actually had 4 different shows in the 1979-1980 season. Angie, which we talked about, that had a similar decline in ratings like the Ropers. And we talked about 1 in a Million. And then Good Time Girls, we've referred to in the past. But then I think ABC may have put this in as a stopgap. They put Laverne and Shirley on in the spring and summer. And the ratings were not that good. I did have some pulled up for the show. After the move to Saturday nights, The Ropers was consistently in the lower half of the ratings, if not even like really, really, really low in the ratings. That's how quickly the ratings dropped. Went from whatever I said earlier, 8th overall, 9th overall, to just dead in the ratings, possibly because of this move to Saturday night. As I've sort of referred to throughout the course of this episode, you can see the Ropers, not just on demand, but there's actually a channel, and I think we've referred to this channel a number of times in the past. There's a channel on Plex called 80s Sitcom Flashback Channel. They literally show 5 series all the time. They show Three's Company, or they show The Ropers, or they show Three's a Crowd, or they show Too Close for Comfort, or they show, check it out, the Don Adams series from the mid-'80s. The commonality between all 5 series being Don Taffner. To say the least, you could see the Ropers almost any time. I mean, you could do it on demand, as I said, but they show most of the series seemingly twice, maybe even 3 times a week. There are some exceptions to that rule about what episodes they show. They've never shown the premiere episode from season 1, where the Ropers moved to the apartment, townhouse, condo, whatever you want to call it. But they have also never shown the premiere of the 2nd season, where Three's Company crew revisits the Ropers. But all the other episodes, all 26 of them, besides those 2 season premieres, you can find them on demand, or they air intermittently on that 80s Sitcom Flashback channel. Well, guys, before we go, have we given justice to the Ropers? Have we justified it being excluded from the 50 worst shows of all time?
I'm not going to say this is one of the worst shows of all time. It borrows heavily from both the show on which it is based, which is George and Mildred in the UK on ITV, and also from its parent show, which is Three's Company. And it makes absolutely no apologies in doing so. I think for that, it ought to be commended, not ostracized or cast away like yesterday's garbage or something.
So you're saying that this should not be on the list of the 50 worst shows of all time?
I don't think it belongs there. Not in retrospect, no.
And we also debated the merits of this on that Presents episode about a month ago, 3 weeks ago. I think we've given the Ropers a little bit of justice. And again, there's plenty of ways to see it. Judge for yourself. But the Ropers in this area, it gets a bad rap. In the end, the Ropers, like Angie, was popular for a season, but then the ratings took a nosedive. Was the schedule the issue? Possibly. Was being too derivative an issue? Possibly. Maybe absolutely might be a better answer to that. But in the end, the Ropers, it became a thing on TV, but justifiably not one of the worst things on TV in television history. You can find us at our website, itwasathingontv.com, on Facebook at It Was a Thing on TV Podcast, and elsewhere at It Was a Thing on TV. You can find us on any podcast player, and we're also on YouTube, where you can subscribe to our channel to keep up to date with our releases, including what's coming up next time. We're going to cover a show that we've sort of been chomping at the bit to cover for a little while. It's a spin-off of a dramatic show, but this spin-off is more comedic. So maybe if you think about it, it's sort of like a reverse of Lou Grant spinning off of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. You go from a comedy to a drama, but now we're going to reverse it and go from a drama to, well, maybe not a full-fledged comedy, but a dramedy. And we've referred to it in the past, and I believe Greg has been like really eager to talk about this series, and we're going to do it next week right here at It Was the Thing on TV. As always, thank you very much for listening. Please be good to each other, and most importantly, please come back next Monday when we talk about that series.
Wow.
Saturday on the Ropers, Stanley and Jeffrey go out on the town.
I wish Helen understood me like you do, Jeff.
But the morning after is no joke. Then, Charlene's angels go undercover on detective school.
If he gets fresh, honey, you just take your pocketbook and whip his head.
And when Gopher becomes a star, it drives all the girls crazy.
I just can't seem to control myself when a man sings to me.
The Love Boat.